Hello, my name is Scott Ray. I'm a species recovery biologist with the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. Today we're going to talk about some of the tips and tricks for your trout in the classroom aquarium that you're going to be working with, and we're going to review some of the stuff that is in the aquarium resource guide. So golden rule for everything, if you want to remember, for your aquarium is if you have any problems, majority of those problems can be accomplished and can be fixed by doing a partial water change. You can see on this aquarium it needed some little bit of tender love and care on this, and we need to do a water change or some algae growth in here, and you can see what it looks like after that. This will take care of the majority of the problems, not all of them, but it will take care of the majority of them. And if you pay attention, there's going to be some gold bars that are going to be popping up through the presentation today that is going to remind you when you can do water changes or when you should be doing water changes. So some of the problems that you can run into that are going to be dealing with your water changes or your aquarium in general is going to be some of your locations. So if you have it really close to a window, you could also have some temperature differences in addition to growing a lot of algae. If you have it near a constant walkway or in a hallway, there's going to be a lot of commotion. It might not cause any problems with your water, but it's going to stress the fish out. If it's right next to the heaters, then you're going to have a fluctuation with the heaters. And in this case, you want to try to keep the temperature lower, so it might put more strain on your chiller. So one of the other things you want to pay attention to is where you're getting your water from. We'll talk about this later on, but you want to make sure that you have good clean water. All the water that's going to be treated for us to drink is just in need of being dechlorinated or removing the chlorine or chloramine that are going to be in the water, and that will be useful for your tank and once it's done and been dechlorinated. Some schools have copper lines. Most of the time, if the copper pipes have water running through them relatively often and it's not sitting there and leaching into the water, it shouldn't be an issue, but this is something that you could also double check and test for before you actually get your fish or your eggs. Some of the other problems that you could have that is going to be the type of substrate that you can actually put in. We might mention this a little bit later, but your small pebbles, rockwork, and stuff like that, if you use limestone, it could raise your pH. If you use some sandstone over time, it could lower your pH. One of the big problems that you're going to have is that if you overfeed, because that can cause an imbalance in your nitrogen cycle, cause increased ammonia and nitrites, and it stresses out the fish quite a bit. If you do not remove any of your dead eggs or dead fish, that can also lead to an imbalance in your nitrogen cycle, and that can also cause some problems. One other mention is I want to make sure that everybody is washing your hands and cleaning them. You want to avoid using sanitizer or really harsh soaps. The best recommendation is to rinse your hands off with water after you had already washed them with soap, so you can make sure there's no residue left over or anything else that you're doing in the immediate area of the classroom. You just make sure your hands are good and clean before you do any kind of maintenance or you're going to do anything in the aquarium. So we're going to go a little bit over the golden rule, which is partial water changes. We talk about your water sources. Some locations are treating with chlorine and some are treating with chloramine. If you use the prime water conditioner that should have came with your kits, that should take care of any chlorine or chloramines. In addition to that, it also removes, detoxifies ammonia, nitrites, nitrates, and it also detoxifies some of the heavy metals that some locations would have. In this case, if everybody is using your local tap water, whether it comes through a full-on treatment plant through a city or it comes from a localized treatment plant, you can get a hold of them and they should be able to tell you what they are treating with, just to be on the safe side. But we always recommend using the water conditioner to make sure it's good and healthy. And best thing to do is to avoid anything that is soaps or chemicals. You see a picture in the bottom right that has a picture of a janitor's closet. I'm sure that there's some of you that is the closest water source. We just want to be very careful with those, because if we get any soaps or residues or any kind of oils or anything like that, some of the cleaning chemicals can be lethal to fish, so we want to make sure we avoid those. If you're using an area like that, just be very careful not to use the same hoses or faucets of any of the cleaning chemicals will be mixed up with. Best recommendation would be to have your own if you have to use a place like that. When you're going to be doing this, your 5-gallon jugs is one of the easiest things that you can use. We'll go into a little bit more depth on some of the other products that you can use to make water changes as easy as you can. So one of the big things, because your aquarium is going to be anywhere from like 55 to 60 degrees on a regular basis, because that's the best condition for growing trout, you got to be careful. You can't just put warm or liquid tap water in. We want to make sure we have a little bit cooler. Best recommendation is to fill up either water bottles or milk jugs, and then you can fill up your buckets, and then you put those bottles in, and they will cool the water down. So within a few degrees of your water in your tank, and then that way make sure that you're going to have a good water and you're going to keep the water temperature stable. So when we do water changes, I don't want people to think that we take all the water out. That was a thing that was done a long time ago in aquariums. Everybody would take out the tank and clean it out completely. We don't want to do that. You want to keep them as stable as you can. So you want to make sure that you're only doing anywhere from 15 to 20% water changes, or 15 to 30% water changes on a regular basis. Now the frequency will change the amount that you can do. If you're going to do it on a weekly basis, 10 to 15% is fine. If you can get every 2 or 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, you can do like a 25 to a 30% at that once a month mark. It's all going to be dependent on what your water testing is, how your fish are reacting to the water, and making sure that everything is healthy within the aquarium. So here's some general tools that you're going to be able to work with. A lot of you already have these. We'll kind of go through that. A siphon and a bucket. When you are doing your water changes, you want to make sure you're taking that siphon and actually gravel vacuuming, putting it down in the gravel and remove any of the fish waste, excess food, could be deceased carcasses that are left over. So you want to make sure you remove all that. And then that's physically taking out some of the products that can cause issues. So the leftover food that can eventually rot and turn into ammonia, that will cause an inability. Your nitrogen cycle might not be able to handle it. Your tank might be able to handle it. So you want to make sure we're physically removing those. So that's one of the best things to siphon. And then you're also pulling out that water, which you replace with clean water that doesn't have any nitrogen compounds in it, ammonia, nitrites, or nitrates. So standard is just a regular siphon with a hose that you're going to drain into a bucket. If you want to get to a little bit more extensive, one of the original products they designed to make water changes easier was the Python water changes. You actually attach this to a sink, and then when you turn the sink on, it creates a siphon, and then it actually pulls the water right out of the aquarium. For many tropical fish keepers, they use this where they can drain the tank to whatever degree they want to do partial water change, and then they actually can turn the valve and you can actually fill it back up with one of these. In your case, it's going to be a little hard to do that because your tank is going to be like in the 50s, so we don't want to take, unless it's probably the middle of winter and you're going to be able to put colder water into the tank. But you should still probably use the buckets to make sure your water temperature is stable. But this will make removing your water a lot easier. In addition to that, there is on the bottom left, there is a PVC and a pump where you actually have it hung over the side of the tank, and that pump will actually pump the water out for you. So that makes water changes a lot easier. And then you could also reverse that and put it into a bucket to pump it back into your aquarium. Or if you have a little bit larger aquarium, I know some there's 75s or 125s, some classrooms have. You can use one of the clean like 30 or 35-gallon garbage cans, and then that way it'll make your water change a little bit easier, and you could take that pump and put it into the garbage can and then fill it back up in your aquarium. So these are things that, makes it a lot easier for you. So if there's any issues, partial water changes, again, that's the golden rule. So most of the issues can be taken care of. So kind of when in doubt, you always want to do a partial water change. Just these are some of the things you want to kind of pay attention to and make sure that we don't have any issues with the temperature for your water change. So now we're going to talk about the nitrogen cycle, which is one of the most important parts of understanding. There is several experiments out there that you can do for some in the Aquarium Resource Guide. We'll explain this a little bit more in depth. And then also in the curriculum, you can find a few different experiments to run. There's a lot of information out there, but this is essentially what's going to keep your fish alive, or other animals if you have other animals that may be a home aquarium or another aquarium in the school. This is what keeps everything in check and makes sure that everything stays happy and healthy. First thing that there is basic thing is you have to add some kind of waste, some type of organic compound that's going to start to decompose. In our case, we're going to be adding some fish food. In some tropical aquariums, they add fish first and then let them go. We're going to talk a little bit about the fishless cycle. So adding that in, you're going to create the waste, which is going to be ammonia. So that ammonia, which can become toxic to fish in higher levels, is going to eventually be decomposed by some nitrosomas. There are some plants that can actually absorb and use up the ammonia as that. Most plants can't use ammonia directly, so it needs to be decomposed. So those nitrosomonas are going to be decomposing the ammonia and turning it into a nitrite, which is still toxic to fish, but less toxic. So nitrites will eventually get decomposed and get turned into nitrates by nitrobacter bacteria. So as those get in, that's the most usable form of nitrogen for plants to use. So that's where it gets removed. Most of the time, that is not lethal to fish unless it's in very high levels. So when you're doing it and you're seeing that end stage, which we'll talk about on the next slide, you're going to be able to see nitrates, and then that's also when you're going to be doing your partial water changes, and that is the leftover food, the excess waste, those products that you're going to be removing through water changes, and that will keep your systems stable. So in this one, it's just a little bit more in depth. So there are some people out there that are running a hydroponic system. So they have some plants that they're trying to grow. So this kind of explains a little bit more. We have the first set where you have ammonia, nitrites, and nitrates. And you can see, and then in nature, this is how it goes. So you have some plants that are going to be able to use that up, and that's showing the fertilizer. And then as the nitrates come through, there's actually a step that uses anaerobic bacteria, which converts the nitrates into some gases as they get decomposed, which is also feeds other plants. Downside is this typically does not happen fully in a freshwater aquarium, which is the reason why we need to do partial water changes to physically remove all those nitrates so that we can complete that cycle. We just need a little bit help. The tank needs a little bit help from us. But you can see as the tank cycles through, you're going to be able to do your, if you have plants, they're going to be using up the nitrates, so that should keep those down. And as long as your ammonia and nitrites are okay, then you should be good. And then your partial water changes should be able to remove anything on the bottom. That would be the nitrates. So our fishless cycle. So when we get this started, one of the biggest things that we're going to be doing is we don't recommend adding any fish to your tank. So you want to just use the fishless cycle where we're going to be adding some food, whether it's leftover trout feed from the year before or some other tropical fish food that you have already on your classroom. So when we go to do this, you're going to be able to add these in. This is immediately going to be starting your decomposition of the fish food, and that's going to be producing ammonia. So there is a video on the TIC webpage that will show up some of the basic setups on how to do this, and then we're going to go into a little bit more depth on what you're going to experience through this fishless cycle. Generally, this should be done anywhere from 5 to 8 weeks ahead of getting your fish or your eggs. This way it allows the tank to fully cycle, and then you shouldn't have any ammonia compounds when you get your fish, because getting your fish or your eggs and putting them into a tank that has high ammonia, nitrites, or nitrates can kill them. So you want to make sure that your tank is up and healthy. So one of the best ways that we found to do this was to keep your chiller off, because the bacteria perform better at higher water temperatures. So your standard room temperature would be fine. That's another reason why it takes anywhere from 5 to 8 weeks. As you're doing this, you would be able to turn your chiller on within the week or so, maybe 4 or 5 days before you actually get your fish or your eggs, to cool it down to the temperature that's required to raise your fish. But this will also hinder a little bit of the cycle, and you may go through a little bit of a ammonia spike or a nitrite spike when you add your fish or your eggs right off the bat. So we also recommend using Microbe Special Blend and Night Out, because those are two additional supplements that will help speed up your life cycle or speed up your nitrogen cycle and make things a little bit easier. And partial, when you do some water changes later on, before you get your fish, you recommend doing a partial water change and adding some of these compounds in there to make sure that your nitrogen cycle is stabilized. So on this one is what to expect when you're doing your fishless cycle. So right now, you can see you're going to be added in on day one. With anywhere from 7 to 10 to 12 days, you're going to see the ammonia spike. So one of the things we recommend is recording all your information. So as you record your information, write it down. Write down if you do your water quality, on what days you're doing it. During this process, it's very nice and you can see the progression of your cycle. So you get the ammonia spike. As the ammonia starts to kind of come down, the nitrates are going to come up because they're going to be building up because the ammonia is going to be breaking down. At the 20 to 25 day mark, you're going to start seeing the nitrites going down, and then you're going to see an increase in nitrates. So anywhere from 30 to 40 days, you're going to be able to have a nitrite spike. You may have a little bit of ammonia, you may have a little bit of nitrite left over, but the majority of what you have in that tank should all be nitrates. And then when you get to that point, you're 30 to 40 days out, you should be able to do a partial water change, maybe remove some of the waste down in there, and you should be getting close to getting ready to get your eggs or your fry. So that's when you do that partial water change, and you can see that it drops down the nitrogen compounds that are in the system. And a fully cycled system that is already stabilized, you should have no ammonia and no nitrites. You may have some nitrates, but they shouldn't be limited. If you have a tank that's stocked very high, then you end up with a little bit of nitrates in there. You may have to perform partial water changes a little bit more often. If you don't have as many fish, then you might be okay to doing water changes a little bit less often. So if you feed very, very heavy, you're going to have more waste in the tank, which will increase ammonia nitrites and nitrates. So the recommendation, if you have a lot of fish or you feed very heavily, you want to make sure that you're performing your partial water changes on a regular basis to keep the tank stabilized. So here's the aquarium cycle, the nitrogen cycle in action. So we're going to explain what's going on each one of these. So you can see the ammonia. And when you're adding the ammonia in there, it comes from the fish waste or the fish food, whether it's uneaten fish food. So then when you're going to move, as it moves through, the bacteria will break it down. Then you're going to end up with nitrites and nitrates. So that filter is going to break it down. There is biomedia in there, which is going to be colonized by good bacteria. The nitrosomas and nitrobacter. And then they're going to be decomposing it as it filters through. And then you're going to move it over. And then there's also some carbon media and sponges in there that you're going to be able to use that are going to physically remove that. And then as you get down to the nitrate stage, you're going to see that. And if you have the hydroponic system or have some plants in there, you're going to be able to see that they're going to be using it up. And if you pay attention to the differences between if you use one and don't use one, you're going to be able to see the differences in the plant growth and in the water quality of your system. So you can see the gold bars around there. If you have fish or eggs in your system and you have high ammonia, best thing to do is do a partial water change. If you have high nitrites, another reason why there's a gold bar there and you can do partial water changes. Same thing with nitrates. Nitrates are readily acceptable. Anywhere from like 60 to 80 part per million is on the higher end. So if you get over 40, we recommend doing partial water changes. So for your filters, this is also in the aquarium resource guide, but you want to pay attention to this because when you do your partial water changes, this is something you should be cleaning on a regular basis to make sure it's working properly. There's going to be a foam insert, which is pretty much the first line. It's going to be pulling particles out. It's the mechanical filtration of the filter. And if food gets sucked up through the filter, it's going to pull those chunks out and it's going to get stuck on there and it's going to pull out the big pieces. Eventually, it's going to work its way through. Sometimes there's a secondary sponge. You also have carbon that's going to be in there, which is going to be pulling out some of the nitrogen compounds or any other impurities like copper or some of the other heavy metals. And so that'll be pulled out. Recommendation on those is to replace it about once a month. I know people that replace it more often and some people replace it less often. It's another reason why you want to pay attention to your individual aquarium, because every aquarium is going to be different, and you want to make sure that it's good, healthy, and stable, and the fish are doing good. You might not need to replace it as often. So then at the top of that, there's going to be a Biomax media, which is a porous ceramic rings, and there's all kinds of holes in there that are going to allow for bacteria to colonize all through that. That is the nitrogen cycle, what we just explained. That's where the bacteria is mainly colonized. It's all over your aquarium, it's in the sponges, it's everywhere in the filter, but this is the main thing. If you have a very high bioload, sometimes we recommend putting extra ones of these in your filter to assist with the cycling of the tank and making sure that you don't have ammonia or nitrates in your system. So sometimes we get people that have almost every single one of their trout live to fry size, and they're maybe 2 or 3 inches. Sometimes the system can't handle that high of an amount, so we recommend putting some more of those in. So going to explain a little bit more in depth about the nitrogen cycle and some of the things that you should worry about and some of the things that you don't need to worry about just yet. So when we're talking about, I mentioned before that ammonia should be at 0 in an established aquarium once everything is done, cycled properly, and there's no other issues with the filters. So if your tank is set up and running and you don't have any issues, your ammonia is at 0, nitrates are at 0, and your nitrates are typically under 40, you're doing a good job. Doesn't always happen that way. So one of the big things we want to make sure is that you keep it as stable as you can. Sometimes some of the tanks will run at like 40 to 60 part per million in nitrates, and the fish are perfectly fine and they can handle it and they don't have any issues with it. As long as you keep it in that range, then you should be good. If you start seeing some of those ammonia creep up or nitrates creep up, or the nitrates get up over 60 or 80, then you want to make sure that you're going to perform that partial water change. One of the big things that you're going to be doing is, as you perform your partial water changes, it's going to reverting back to what your source water is, which is one of the big things that we recommend paying attention to. Also doing some water testing on it, make sure there's ammonia, no nitrites, no nitrates. Check your alkalinity and stuff, which we're going to be talking on the next slide. So we want to make sure we have good records of those when you're starting up your aquarium. For all water parameters, so you have a comparison as your tank gets fully cycled and you get further on into your fish production. So just a general guideline, you can see some of the smiley faces over there. Some of the problems that you're going to run into is, in addition to the ammonia, nitrates, and nitrates, you may run into some problems with your pH. If your pH is very low or very high, I want you to compare it to your source water. So if your source water is coming out of your tap or your source at, let's say, 8.0, and you're worried because you see other people that have, their tank is 7.2 or 7.4, we don't recommend doing any drastic changes, adding chemicals or anything like that to alter the pH, because as you do that, every time you do a partial water change, it's going to revert back to the source water. So it's always going to be 8.0 water going into your system. You would have to treat all your water every single time you do water changes into your system. So the fish typically can handle a wide range of pH. So you want to make sure that once you get them in there and get them stabilized, don't really alter it. We don't recommend doing chemicals, because every time you do your partial water change, it'll revert back to that water and it'll keep it stable. And like I mentioned on the previous slide, stability is the key. You want to make sure that you don't have any problems with that. Some of the problems that are going to, or the issues that are going to be causing these problems are if you have too many fish in the tank. Sometimes we get really high numbers, so we have to do that. In addition to have high numbers, you want to make sure you're not feeding too much and making sure that all food's getting eaten within a couple minutes of feeding them. So if your filter doesn't work properly, that's another reason why we want to check that every time you do partial water changes, check it on a regular basis. And then if you waited too long and you start getting a buildup, because over time everything is going to keep building up in the system, and you're going to eventually have higher nitrites and nitrates that are going to show up in the system because they're kind of getting bound up at the end and they're going to build up over time. Like I already mentioned, not having enough biomedia. If you have a very large amount of fish, or the fish are getting very big, they're producing a lot of waste, sometimes we can add in more of that biomedia. So that's another good addition to your partial water changes. So some of the symptoms that you're going to see are going to be labor breathing. If you want to pay attention, another reason why we recommend writing really good notes is because you want to pay attention to the fish. Are the fish swimming around actively? Are they moving around? Or are they darting and scratching off rocks? Or are they hanging out at the surface, kind of swimming at like a 45-degree angle and breathing really heavy? If you look at them and they look stressed, or they're just laying on the bottom of the substrate, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to these things. Quick notes on those helps us a lot. If you have any other problems and you get a hold of the TIC coordinator, when we need to troubleshoot some of the problems, knowing what the fish were doing before you had a problem really helps us a lot. And then we can kind of gauge down exactly when you started having problems with the system. So what happens when you start having some problems and you need to take action? So paying attention to all those keys that you're doing when you're watching your fish, keeping those good notes, getting a hold of the TIC coordinator if there's any other major problems. So some of the things you're going to see as you start seeing the high ammonia, high nitrites, high nitrates, you can see my gold bars over there. You want to make sure that those partial water changes are pretty much going to be the first thing you're going to do, and that'll simplify any kind of problems. You shouldn't be afraid of doing partial water changes as long as they're done earlier, like we had talked, where if a 15 to 30%, making sure that you're acclimating the temperature, it's not within a few degrees, or it's within a few degrees of your standard aquarium water. We'll recommend adding some prime water conditioner because that will detoxify some of the ammonia, nitrites, and nitrates. Most of the problems that we have when there's a water testing done, you're going to have high ammonia or nitrites. Nitrites actually causes some problems with the oxygen absorption into the gills, which we'll explain a little bit later, but you want to make sure that that is an immediate fix. So a partial water change, adding C-Chem prime, and then also the Night Out 2 will assist in keeping your nitrogen cycle properly cycled and working properly. So the classrooms that use their hydroponics or a style system, so some of those plants, if they're not fully growing, or maybe you harvested some of the plants, that can additionally change a spike, and then you just want to make sure that you're able to do partial water changes and you're keeping up with your water testings to know when you need to do partial water changes. So on this one, we're going to talk about the other parameters that may cause an issue, or you think may cause an issue, which is going to be hardness, alkalinity, and your pH. So your hardness, it varies throughout the whole state. Most of the areas are anywhere from 150 to 300. That should be based off your source water. Another reason why we want to test your source water right at the beginning. So your alkalinity is also going to be loosely based off of your hardness, depending on the amount of calcium that is in the water. Magnesium also factors that. Majority of our area is anywhere from 120 to 300. If you're on a spring or a well, most of the time your pH is high, and that's a result of your alkalinity being higher. And you also typically have a little bit harder water. There are some systems where the pH is in the mid 6s, and that is based off your source water. If in your area maybe there's some acid mine drainage, or the water source is coming from a larger river that the pH is a little bit altered. So for these things, we recommend not trying to change this. I already told you that the pH, we don't want to alter that. What actually happens when you add one of the pH ups or downs, it'll either add an acid or a base, which will get rid of that alkalinity, which will actually alter the pH over time. Downside is every time you do a partial water change, it's going to revert back to your source water. There are some that have trout and they live perfectly fine in 6.5 pH with very little alkalinity and very low soft or very soft water. There's other people that have a pH in the 8s and their water is very hard and the alkalinity is over 300. They're perfectly fine. Another thing I mentioned again is every single tank is different. You want to make sure that you're not comparing it to everybody else's. You want to keep a watch on your own. Make sure that when you started it up, you have your water quality, and make sure that it stays stable through the whole time. The fish want stability. They don't want fluctuations going up and down and all over the place. So you want to make sure that you can keep everything stable, keep with your same water source, as long as it's good and healthy and there's no chlorine or treated, and then you don't have copper or any other chemicals in the water. Keeping it stable is the best thing for the fish. So now we're going to talk a little bit about your fish. In this case, we're going to go through osmoregulation, which there is another couple of experiments in the curriculum resource. So you're going to be able to do some experiments with this, which could help you explain a little bit more to the kids. When we're talking about fish, osmosis is the process of moving water through a different membrane depending on what type of animal or substance is going to be moved. So as that water moves, the salt or other concentrations of whatever is in that system does not move. So the idea is that it's supposed to be unequal on both sides. So water is going to move from an area where there is more water to an area where there's less water, because the salt concentration in this case, or the other mineral concentration, they can't move through that membrane. So what you're going to talk about in freshwater versus saltwater. Freshwater fish, typically they don't drink as much, and when they do, their intake, they're absorbing all the mineral content because they want to keep their body concentration a little bit higher than what is outside in the freshwater. It's the opposite in saltwater. They're going to be drinking, and they're going to actually expelling because they want to keep their salt concentration and mineral concentration in their body a little bit lower than the outside water. So for freshwater, you can see obviously where the movement of the water is constantly going in through the mouth, uptake through the gills, and they're absorbing all those minerals and salts. So as they're going that, they're keeping their body constantly going through. So what they actually expel is a dilute urine, because they're keeping most of the mineral content in their body because they want to keep it higher than what the outside water is. So for saltwater, they actually want to do the opposite. They want to drink the water, and they actually want to expel most of the salts because they're trying to keep their body salt and mineral content lower than typically what the outside saltwater is. So they're very high concentrated urine, which is mostly filled with a bunch of different salts. So they're going to be drinking that up, and they're going to be removing most of the salt concentration to keep their body in somewhat of an equilibrium with the water surrounding them. So one of the basic experiments that you can do is going to be on the curriculum guide. And it's with grapes or raisins. And this is going to show exactly what happens after you soak grapes or raisins in a high salt and a low salt concentration. So what's going to happen is, as the water from the outside of the grapes or the raisins is going to move, but the mineral content is not going to move. So you have grapes that are very high, dense with water, and your raisins obviously are dehydrated and there's not much water in them. So you're going to be able to see the water is going to turn around and move from the outside solution, which is in a low mineral salt concentration. For the raisins, they're actually going to have water is going to infiltrate into the raisins, where in the grapes, the water is actually going to move, and it's going to be out, and it's going to kind of be a soft grape, and it's going to be a more puffy raisin. So we talked a little bit about salt. This is one of the reasons why we recommend adding some aquarium salt to the system, because if you have any problems with your nitrogen cycle, one of the problems that you're going to run into is a little bit of ammonia or nitrates. This general tonic of adding salt in your system will help prevent any major stresses with a little bit of ammonia. But what it does is it actually helps the osmoregulation on the gills moving back and forth with the oxygen. So the salt is going to help block out the nitrites and allow the gills to work properly with the chloride ions that are in the water, and that's what transfers the oxygen into the system. It blocks, the salt blocks the nitrates from getting into the system, and nitrates actually bind to the hemoglobin in the blood, which prevents oxygen from bonding to the hemoglobin, which eventually would suffocate the fish. In addition to protecting against any problems with your nitrogen cycle, it also promotes a very healthy slime coat, which prevents disease. And if there is any wounds or any issues where there's scratches or marks or an open sore, that'll also allow them their natural defense, as the minerals from the salt will actually help them heal up faster. And it also reduces the stress because their body's not working as hard to uptake salt concentration to keep it higher than the outside freshwater. So it makes it a little bit easier on the fish. If there is any problems with disease, we're going to go into that in a couple slides, and we'll kind of explain a little bit more on how to do some salt concentrations and treatments for you. In addition to that, if you do have a parasite, it also reduces the stress on the fish from that parasite. Most parasites are very small for the fish, and they don't like a little bit of salt concentration. It's not going to kill them right off the bat in small concentrations, but it will not make them happy, and it will help the fish eventually get rid of them with their natural immune system. So what we recommend buying is a uniodized salt with particularly no additives. The best type that we have is, you could do canning or pickle salt, or if you have a feed store close to you, there is a feed salt that is used for animal feed, and that's a pelletized. It looks just like table salt, but we do not recommend table salt. Table salt is iodized, so we want to make sure we don't use that because the iodine is not good to the fish. Some of the things we want to try to avoid. There is rock salt out there, some of the water softener salts, and then salt blocks for water softeners. The salt blocks and the water softener salt, typically they have a binding agent or a caking agent in there. It has been known to cause problems. I do know some people that use them, but we recommend using this because this is the purest form of salt, and it's also a food grade, and that also makes it a little bit easier because it's already in the pelletized form and it dissolves very fast for you. So what we want to do when we're treating these, so the general guideline to be proactive is a tablespoon for every 5 gallons. So if your tank is up and running and you really don't have any problems, you can start reducing that amount. You can do it at a half dose. If you have high nitrates, or if there's a really high amount of fish and they're having problems breathing and stuff like that, and you've done your water changes, I would keep it at the general tablespoon for every 5 gallons. There are people that recommend doing it a half a dose, just to make sure that's a general tonic, just to help them in general. If you don't have any issues, that will be fine. Biggest thing you need to pay attention to is you treat it as a water conditioner. Salt is in the system until it gets physically removed. The best way that that happens is physically removing your water. If you have to add a gallon or two to your tank every week because of evaporation, the water is evaporating out, not the salt. So you don't need to add it. It's only when you physically take out X amount of gallons for your water change, and that will be adding in. So you say you do 10-gallon water change on your tank, you're going to be doing 2 tablespoons of salt, and then you're going to be adding your water conditioner in before you add it to the tank. So you want to make sure that you're following that, and it's going to be based on how big of a water change you're going to be doing. When you have sick fish, there's going to be a separate one. This is mainly caused by using an outside source water that's not treated with chlorine or anything like that. If you use a spring or a well, typically that is where it can get introduced into your system. If you received a second batch of replacement fish where you get fry instead of eggs, sometimes they can come in with ick. Majority of the time in your TIC aquariums, you don't have any problems with ick, but it does show up. So if it does show up, one of the things we can do, in addition to having the proactive amount of salt in your aquarium, we can do what we actually recommend as a salt dip. The pathologist for the Pennsylvania Fish and Bill Commission, Koja, he actually talked through this a little bit and talks about the life cycle. So if you want to see his video, you can make sure that you watch that, and it'll explain a little bit more into the life cycle and treatments. So for the treatment, we recommend a 3% salt dip for anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes is recommended. If you can get them close to 15, that's even better. There's more of a chance that the external parasite is going to be killed off. The fish are not going to like it. They are going to dart around, so I just want you to be prepared. They do not like it, and most of the time they have no problems with it. They can withstand it for the 10 to 15 minutes. Sometimes if they're really small, we recommend doing it closer to 5. You may just have to do it for multiple days. On the bottom left, have a comparison to what you're doing. If you're thinking, oh, we're turning our tank into a saltwater aquarium, that's not the case. So if you do that salt treatment as a actual for ick, that salt treatment at 3%, it's not quite fully saltwater yet. So obviously the fish aren't going to like it because they come from fresh water. But you're looking at a 3.5% for standard saltwater. If we drop it down and go to the proactive one, a tablespoon per gallon is about 20 grams or so, which is at about 0.5% or 5,000 part per million. So we're way less than what standard saltwater is. So if you do a tablespoon, standard is going to get you about that 0.5%. So if you drop it down and do a little bit less than that, you're even at 1,000 parts per million. If anybody that has the new filtering mechanisms out there, that's a saltwater pool, the standard for saltwater pools is 3,000 part per million. So in reality, you're not anywhere near a saltwater, so don't think you're doing anything crazy where having salt in your system. It just really helps as a general preventative and makes the fish a lot healthier in the long run. And then it also has some disease capabilities down the line. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to recap some of the main issues that we've had over the past few years. So some of the problems that you're going to encounter, hopefully you don't encounter them, but some of the problems are pretty common. One of the things we recommend when you're doing your acclimation, whether you get your eggs or you have replacement fry that come by, when you're acclimating them, you want to let them sit in there. In the aquarium resource guide that explains everything that goes on here. But we want to make sure that you're setting them in a tank in the bag, but you want to make sure that you actually keep that bag closed right now. You want to acclimate through the temperature. Right now, the temperature is the biggest thing. So when you're doing that acclimation and you're getting the temperature close to the same size, if you open that bag, all the CO2 that's been built up in that bag from the fish producing, then respiration, it's going to release from the water. It's going to have a huge impact on the pH, and that could be a sudden change. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned stability is the key. We don't want sudden changes. So if you open the bag up and then set them in your tank, you're going to have a lot of stressed fish. They may not die, but they will be very stressed out, and it could cause more problems down the road because they could have some ammonia burn that could inhibit their gills if you have fry. So you want to make sure that you're going to keep the bag. Once you do that, and once you get the temperature close, anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes, if the fish are okay in the bag and they're not darting around and not gasping for air, you can get closer to the 30 minutes. If there's problems and the fish don't look good and they're hanging out the surface, or maybe there's already some dead in the tank, you can get them out as soon as you get the water somewhat close. So you would be able to open up the bag, and then what you want to do is drain off that water, pour the fish through a net into a bucket, and then you can just take that net and put the fish right in the tank, and then you dump away your aquarium water or the bag water. You do not want to put that dirty water from your fry or your egg shipment in to the aquarium. It is laced with ammonia, nitrates. It's going to be very dense, and pouring that water into the bag or from the bag into the tank can definitely cause problems in your aquarium. It'll throw your nitrogen cycle off balance. In addition to that, it's going to cause problems with the fish that just came out of it because they don't want ammonia in their bag, and they're in a nice clean tank, and then all of a sudden they got ammonia dumped back in their water. So we want to make sure we don't put that back in there. And we want to try to avoid shocking the eggs or the fry by trying to get them as close temperature-wise as you can. Typically 15 minutes to 20 minutes is usually all you need. So I mentioned before, your high and low pH or your water hardness, your alkalinity. So those are all controlled by your source water. Don't get worried. I know I mentioned it again, but we have people that still get worried because their pH turns out to be 8.4 or 8.6, but they're on a well. Their water coming into their school is from a well, so you're naturally going to have higher alkalinity, higher hardness. The pH is typically going to be higher. And that's all dependent on each one. Another reason why we say each aquarium is different, so you want to make sure that you pay attention to your aquarium and not necessarily everybody else, because depending on what the area is going to depend on your source water. So in addition to that, We've had some problems where people put sandstone in there, and as the filter starts to go across there, it'll start breaking it down, and it also can lower the pH. Or we have people that put limestone, large rocks in, and that actually raises your pH. So we would try to want to avoid some of those. They're fine to put in your aquarium, but you want to make sure that you have the ability that you know, okay, well, my pH might rise up, and every time I do partial water changes, it's going to be bringing it back down because my source water is lower or higher. Driftwood also puts some tannins into the water, so that's something else you can be careful with. It'll make it look a brown tint. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's dirty, but it will look dirty. So some of the other problems that we have with some of the older schools, they have old copper lines, or they treat with some caustic soda as a cleaning agent for those lines. So we recommend doing a copper test, and or even maybe some other heavy metal testing in the water that is your source water if it's coming out of the faucet or you're getting it from a local place. We recommend usually using your tap water because it's stable and it's easy to use. You just need to make sure you treat it with your water conditioner. So in this case, the prime should be able to take care of many of the metals that are in there. ChemiPure is another one that we recommend, which is a carbon and an ion exchange resin, which is really good, and you can use that and actually add it right into your filter. We also have polyfilter. So a polyfilter is a little foam compound that is going to be added into your tank, or you can add it directly into your filter, and that absorbs any kind of chemicals. It also absorbs ammonia nitrites too. So if you have any problems with ammonia nitrites, which we'll get to on the next side of this slide, that's something else that'll be in there that you can kind of pay attention to. So water changes and knowing your source water are very vital to what's going on in your aquarium and keeping it healthy. Cycling is probably the biggest problem that we have. You want to make sure your tank is cycled properly, and it takes anywhere from 5 to 8 weeks, depending on the tank. So keeping that chiller off definitely helps the cycle faster. The downside is you start to turn it back on and you start dropping your temperature down before you get your fish or your eggs. It causes that bacteria to kind of get sluggish. They don't want to work properly. But what's going to happen is there's going to be an abundance of ammonia that's going to come up, or nitrites that are going to come up. So you're going to get more bacteria that will eventually colonize because the other ones aren't producing enough. So as they produce, they're going to change the amount of each one in order to get it stabilized. Typically, we don't recommend any water changes during the cycling process. The reason that is because you want to make sure that it stabilizes on its own. Downside is if it's not stable and you already have eggs or fish and you have high ammonia nitrites, that's when you want to keep doing your water changes. But when you initially do your fishless cycle, just let it run its course and let it run for the 4 to 8 weeks. So the high ammonia nitrites, biggest cause is excess food. So if you have a bunch of food and you're feeding in there and they don't eat it within 4 or 5 minutes and it lays at the bottom, it's going to rot. It's going to turn into ammonia, which is what you just used months before that to get your tank cycled. So you want to make sure that everything is being eaten. You don't want to have a ton of extra food in there. You want to make sure they eat it all. If you have deceased fish, you want to make sure that you're removing those because they are going to turn around and they're going to start to decompose and they're going to turn into ammonia. So when you're doing that, removing that excess food, removing any deceased fish, that'll be vital into keeping your ammonia nitrites down. So the other thing is sometimes if you have a source water that is treated with chloramines, it is a combination of chlorine and ammonia. So you already have ammonia in your system, which is another reason why we recommend the prime water conditioner, because it will bind that the prime will bind the ammonia up and then detoxify it, and then it lets your cycle take care of it and get the bacteria in your aquarium will get rid of it. The high nitrates, typically it's caused by an abundance of food that has been left in the aquarium over time, or you have deceased fish that have been left in the aquarium over time, and you get a buildup of the filter material, the particulates that have been filtered out. If you don't clean your filters out, you get that gunky material, the sludge there. That's what you want to physically remove because that will get rid of the majority of the problem. Also, the same reason why we gravel vacuum and get rid of the waste and the excess food, if there is any, in the gravel. So when you're doing that, you're getting your gravel out, and that's why you check your filter and make sure they're clean, and then that will get rid of that high nitrates. If for some reason, during your initial process when you get the fish, you have really high ammonia or nitrites, you can do partial water changes that are greater than that 30% we recommend. In this case, it is done because you want to make sure that you're going to be able to keep your fry or your fish, your eggs alive. So sometimes it's very necessary to keep reducing that amount. If the system is not stabilized, the nitrogen cycle is not stabilized, you may have really high ammonia and nitrite amounts, and that little bit of salt that's going to be in there might not be enough to protect them. So doing those large partial water changes to keep it down is the only necessary or only way that you're going to be able to keep those fish alive until your system gets cycled. Most of the time you can do partial water changes if you have to, and it's really high, and you know maybe like 3 or 2.5, and the nitrites are maybe upwards of like 8 or 10. Then you can have those big water changes, and you're going to have to do it on a regular basis pretty much every day, and then maybe start reducing the amount or doing it every other day until the system starts to stabilize again. Doesn't usually happen, but sometimes it does happen where we get really, really high ammonia night because somebody dumped their bag of fish water from the fry replacement into a tank, and it was laden with water, or laden with the water from the bag was laden with ammonia, and it ends up throwing the ammonia off, and then the nitrogen cycle can't get rid of it. So the bacteria is not up to the proper levels with that big of an ammonia spike, and then you end up with ammonia spike, and then a couple days later you might have higher nitrites. So in that case, that's another option. In addition to that, keeping notes on everything that you have going on in your aquarium. I recommend to keep an eye on what's going on with your fish, if they're swimming around perfectly fine, or if they're darting around, or maybe they're rubbing on rocks, or they're just swimming around, or they're laying on the bottom. You want to make sure you pay attention to that. Every time you do your water quality, you want to make sure every water parameter that you tested, you write down and record. If there's any problems, the Trout in the Classroom troubleshooting contact, the coordinator is going to be the ra-troutclass@pa.gov. So that's going to be your contact. In addition to that, you can reach out to your TIC partners, and they might be able to help you out also. But you want to make sure you have records, because if you know, okay, the fish were perfectly fine last week, and then maybe you did a water change and you forgot to put the dechlorinator in there, and that's the only thing that's been different between Friday and Monday, and you have some dead fish in your tank. Or if you know that somebody fed and they fed too much, you want to make sure that you have record of that, because when you get a hold of the TIC coordinator and knowing what was going on over the past couple weeks, that'll help us clarify what's going on in the tank and should allow us to troubleshoot and get the problem resolved for you. So as a last resort, always have questions, just let your TIC coordinator know.